I'm delighted to have you here with us this afternoon, Janine. Thank you very much for coming.
Alison, it's always a pleasure to be with you, no matter where or when or what's happening.
You're always so generous. I would like to start with asking you to give us an overview of the different schools there are of family therapy.
Well, I'm going to give you like 3 or 4 of the main ones.
You're right, yes.
Because there are, you know, you could probably, depending on how you describe them, you know, talk about 12 or 16.
Right, okay.
But I think 3 of the most important are the multi-generational model that many people connect up with Murray Bowen, as one of the main people who started to develop that. And that model is really trying to look historically through time at a family's, there are lines of patterns of what has happened in the family over time and how certain events in an earlier generation might affect following generations. For example, in my family, my great-grandfather committed suicide, and my father had many problems with depression and questions about his own relationship to his, you know, if he might do something to hurt himself or not, and had electroshock treatments. And if you look back through the lineage, you can see where, you know, some of this history came from.
Right.
And that's quite different from the structural model of Minuchin, Salvador Minuchin, who came actually from Argentina, where you're looking much more at the present dynamic and trying to look at what's the current structure of the family, and you're still looking at the context of the family, which is essential to any family therapy model, but it's much more focused on the day-to-day interaction that's happening within, say, the parental subsystem, the subsystem of the children, the parent-child subsystems, and breaking it down to look at those day-to-day interactions versus a narrative model, which is a more recent, and I'm doing these models kind of in order historically of when they were developed. And with the narrative model, and looking at people like Michael White in Australia, who helped very much to develop that, you're looking much more at the family conversation, the dialogues, the stories, and the meaning making that people are making, as opposed to looking at the structure, as opposed to looking at so much of the historical. So you're trying to find out what kinds of conversations people are in within a family, and who's listening to who and who's not, and how are they heard in the larger society as well, and how this then affects the day-to-day dynamics. So it's much more about meaning making.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And so I imagine that there must be many purists that only stick to one model. Is it possible to be eclectic and choose different elements of different models at different times?
Absolutely. And if you looked at the models that were being developed, like say more in the 70s or 80s, there were more people that were focusing more on being so-called purists. There's much more crossover and interchange and developing of ideas, you know, in between models and crossing models now. The thing I think is important when you think about being eclectic is that you be somewhat aware of why you're choosing this aspect of this model and putting it with this aspect of another model. It's like, like just being cognizant and clear for yourself what you're doing, as opposed to just kind of mixing and matching.
Right. So. And the expectation that you have of what it will contribute to the process.
Right. Absolutely.
Right. Okay. Could you describe for us some of the key tools of a family therapist?
Listening.
Right.
And not just listening to the words, but all of the nonverbal postures and all the ways that when we communicate thousands of pieces of information with our faces, you know, with our movements, and we're taking those in. We're not even conscious of many of the pieces of information that we're taking in. So that listening, observing, and paying attention to what's happening among a group of people. And it's much different when you're working with a family versus an individual, because you're not just paying attention to, so I'm talking to you and you may be the sister in the family. Meanwhile, I'm watching and seeing how the mother is listening to you, and I'm seeing what happens when the brother interrupts you. And so it's not just taking in information from a person, it's from the whole system and the dynamic of the whole system. And crucial to that is not only just my listening and observing, it's the observing and listening of other people in the family, and also they're observing and listening to me and deciding, what they're going to disclose or talk about depending on how I'm talking to you. So it's multi-level.
It is.
And that's what makes the work so absolutely fascinating, because it's almost like you're in a theater work. You're on a journey together with the family as they're creating, their own theater. Right. So.
And I know that in your work you use rituals. In fact, you've written many articles, and I think even 2 books on rituals. Could you explain to us what you mean by the term ritual, what a ritual is, and how you use it, and why it works?
Sure. And I guess one other thing I want to add to, besides the listening and observing too, also, is key is the witnessing to what people's stories are, and central as well is helping them to get to what are the dynamics and the interactions that they're having difficulty with, and helping them to change those. And the focus in family therapy is so much on what happens outside of the sessions, because that's where it's the day-to-day life that people are living where you want to have the impact. It's not like an individual therapy where many times the focus is so much on the personal relationship that you have with your client and what's happening in that dynamic. In many ways, you want your relationship to become less and less important in family therapy, because it's about their interaction and their day-to-day life outside of therapy. And that can bring us to rituals, because every family has 4 different kinds of rituals, and many times they don't even recognize them as rituals, because you have the day-to-day rituals, like how do you get up in the morning, how do people greet each other, how do you leave the house for wherever you need to go to, what happens at meal times, what happens when kids go to bed. For example, putting a 5-year-old to bed and helping them make that transition from the activity of the day to the quiet of the night. Very different than a nighttime ritual for a 15-year-old or for an adult. I mean, many times for me, I love to read novels about families because I feel like the author has taken care of all the family dynamics. I don't need to think about them. I can just enjoy all these different perspectives that the author has, and it's a way for me to leave my work, enter into somebody else's world, and transition to the world of the night, of sleeping and so on. So every family has these day-to-day rituals that really help them through the rhythm of the day, and marking the changes of the day. And then we have the rituals that bring us what we call family traditions, to things like our birthdays, our anniversaries, our vacations, that are key events that are unique to that family. And birthdays are a way to mark our entrance into this world, and what it means to a family to have had a child come into the world, etc. So you have those family traditions, and then you have the cultural celebrations, some of which may be religious, others may be secular. So things like Hanukkah or Ramadan or Christmas or New Year's, Diwali. So from all different, and every country has, like 4th of July, or Independence Day here in Mexico. And those are rituals that connect us more to the larger community in some ways. And yet they can be rituals that can be harder because there's expectations in the community, you know, like you see all the propaganda for Christmas, you know, like in the U.S., it's like you've got the mother, you've got the father, you've got the two children, and they're, you know, have all these very expensive presents that they're getting and these amazing meals. And
they all love each other all the time.
Right, and it can be a lot of pressure on families at this time. So these are, they're larger community connecting rituals, but also ones that can sometimes isolate families. So you think about, like, say, Mother's Day, and you've got a child in a school whose mother recently died, and so we have to be very attentive to how these rituals actually can affect families. And then there's the family life cycle rituals. So birth, christenings, graduations from school, marriage, divorce, all the way up to retirement, to death. I mean, they take us on the journey from life to death, and we call them the family life cycle rituals. And those are very unique to each family, but at the same time, they do connect them across many communities because everybody goes through that life cycle journey.
So there's the four key types of rituals. How do you use rituals in your work with families?
Well, one is just helping them to identify them and then to see them as a resource. So, for example, I worked with a family where the father had recently died, and they had 3 children, and for them, you know, this whole question of his loss and his death and managing it, the kids who ranged in age from 8 to 13 no longer wanted to sit at the dinner table. They were grabbing the food and wanting to sit in front of the TV because, as we talked together, found out from the kids that it's a time when they just remembered their father too much, because they had this particular setup in their family where the mother and the father sat together, and their backs were against the wall and this big window that looked out on a garden, and then so they were together at one side of the table, and then each of the 3 kids had their place on the
other ends of the table, the other sides of the table.
And now they would sit there and they would see just their mom, and their sense of her being alone, of what they had lost, and so we began to do some things around, well, what would it mean if you just put something there next to your mom that reminded you of something special about your dad, so that his presence was still there, and you could talk about it a little bit, and you could, and, well, what would it mean if you just continued to make some of the special foods that he liked? And we found some ways for them to kind of hold his presence at the table and be able to talk about it openly, but at the same time to mark that he wasn't there. And ultimately, what they ended up doing was buying a round table and changing that plate, you know, again, as a way to mark, we are still a family, we're structured differently, we have lost somebody who's very dear to us, but we can go on and we can, you know, gather. We don't have to distract ourselves from the pain with the TV, and so helping families to see rituals as a resource to help make and mark the transitions that everybody has in their lives, because rituals give us both change and continuity at the same time.
Right.
And because you know, you have things that stay the same with sitting there at that table, and they had things that they changed, and there's always this duality of continuity and change with rituals. It's very powerful, and because we're enacting them, we're not just talking about something, we're living it, we're in the process, we're in the middle of it. They're very powerful.
Yes. And they sound like something that can be very used in a lot of circumstances to help families.
Absolutely, and you can call upon any of the 4 types. You know, if a birthday's coming up,
right,
you know, or it's a half birthday of somebody, and it's somebody who's feeling very isolated in the family. Oh, well, let's make a half birthday celebration for them, you know. Or if a holiday is coming up that traditionally has been something that's been complicated or difficult for family interactions, you can use it as a way to help them change what they're going to do for the holiday, because it's not really just the ritual, it's as much the process of how you're going about planning, reorganizing, and changing the ritual that's where the dynamics are starting to shift.
Right, right.
So
It helps you through the very, very difficult change period. Okay. As you know, Janine, well, as I hope you know, you have been integral into helping JUCONI, the JUCONI Foundation, introduce family work and strengthen our work with families. What advice would you have to an organisation that is thinking about starting to work with families?
Well, a lot of this advice would come from watching what you guys have done. Believe me, I've learned so much from what you've done, because I've seen all the ways that you would start, say, with one person in the family, then bring in another person, and then start to look at the wider context of, okay, maybe it's not just the mother and the stepfather here, but are there other people, are there grandparents, are there cousins, are there other people that can also be resources that we should be aware of, especially with all the multi-generational families in Latin America, for example, if we think about that area of the world. So starting small and letting the ripples go out. You start with one family and they're in a particular neighborhood. They can be used to help recruit other families, because as you build a trusting relationship with them, they start to talk to other people about what's happening, and you become known as an organization little by little within communities. And there are ways, I think, also within communities to keep connecting up with whatever institutions might be, you know, like small religious groups, or little community centers, or even places like a peluqueria where somebody's getting their hair cut. You know, I mean, those become community places where you stop in, you get to know those people, you get to know, because they have contacts with families. So helping to, little by little, spread your network out, and also counting on your families that they're going to be, I mean, I've certainly seen it with JUCONI, where, I mean, because they are so deeply impacted and appreciative of what they've gotten in their work with JUCONI, they then become terrific ambassadors.
Yes, they do. So really, it's start small and build up from there.
Right, and use networks.
Right. Thank you very much.